Okay, today is the beginning of a new experiment on this channel. It is coming out of the feedback process we do here, an attempt for me to define terms that we can use in future discussions. Now, this is going to be controversial, and I hope this doesn't turn into a garbage fire arguing about whether or not this is the real definition of the term. This is my understanding, the way I use these words, not necessarily the pop culture scope creep, messed up version of this stuff. And I hope it helps explain more where I'm coming from. And I'm doing this because you guys thought it was a good idea. So the first word I want to define is what feminism actually means to me. Feminism is the examination and advocacy for equality among the sexes based on an understanding that historically the feminine has been seen as a state of weakness or lacking as opposed to masculinity. That's what it means to me. It doesn't mean I believe that women should get special privileges. I'm a big crusader against benevolent sexism. And I don't believe that women are, oppressed to the way we were in pre-first wave feminism. There are still things to look at. Unique self-esteem issues that differ between men and women, unique job issues, unique legal issues. And to me, I don't think that we can separate one from the other because you can't look at something in isolation. I understand that some people have the issue with the term feminism because it is a inherently feminine word, but my use of the term feminism means the advocating for equal status given to feminine qualities. And this, can mean men who want to spend time with their kids as much as women who want to pursue careers. And the reason I don't call it, egalitarianism is that throws a whole bunch of other things into it, and it creates an element of intersectionality. And I am an intersectional feminist, but that's not the same as all people should just be equal in all ways. No one can possibly be an expert on everything. There are too many cultures, there are too many issues, there are too many displaced indigenous peoples like the Romani, the Tibetan people, First Nations Americans and Canadians. I can't possibly be an expert on all these things, so I'm not going to pretend to be. I am constantly learning about how other social things like race, like status, are how they intersect with the issues of gender, but I am aware that that's going to have to evolve. Like everything evolves, but that is why I define as a feminist, because I wouldn't be speaking about issues affecting, Creole Ojibwe men. I'm not an expert. I think that Creole Ojibwe men should be as equal as anybody else. But I don't really know the first thing about their issues. So that's why I don't say egalitarian. I say feminist, because it is the examination of gender from looking at the feminine as well as females. Makes sense? Makes sense. The reason it's feminism, historically, when you get into things like art history and literature and things like that is an identified problem, and it is still an issue that the majority of published academics and published authors are still men across the board. There are exceptions in certain disciplines, but we're not talking about degrees. We're talking about people who are adding to the catalog. And so part of it is creating more content by women in these fields. And that doesn't mean I want anything by men to go away. I think men should keep making their stuff. We need to just encourage and support women, so women who have something to say feel equally empowered to do it as the men who have something to say. And that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. That doesn't mean there aren't a lot of sacrifices to be made. It's very hard for anybody to get something published or released. But there's also nothing wrong with trying to get more representation from the other 50% of humanity, right? Right. All right. That's what it means to me. And now I wait for the comments to rip that apart and parse words and pick it apart. But moving on. Patriarchy. Yeah, I'm not making it simple here. Patriarchy is not something one man does to one woman. Patriarchy are systems. They're, if you think about the old school British system where men owned property, patrilineal descent rights, meaning land is inherited through the father. Immigration is sometimes looked at through the father's line, and it was divine right of kings, not queens, kings. If there was a male in the family, he became king. That is patriarchy. And while we don't live in the West under, divine right of kings anymore, there are still places in the world that do still have monarchies at the highest level. So we do still have to examine patriarchal systems. There have been very few matriarchal systems historically. They thought there were a few, but when they actually examined some of these structures, they were actually sort of a split governance system. Any matriarchal societies on a small scale were wiped out in the Bronze Age warfare. So there is this issue where all our traditions are based on the idea of father knows best, Mr. President, king of the castle. These sorts of structures die hard. And so while we acknowledge that certainly we are not living in England in the 1800s anymore, we have to continue to monitor how our traditions that are based in these patriarchal histories and certain religious hierarchies that are still patriarchal or partially patriarchal, how this affects the communities that they touch. So that's what it means. And that's tied into this idea of privilege. The two are connected. Now, there's lots of different types of privilege. The type of privilege that feminists tend to deal with is male privilege. And the best way to explain, male privilege so that people can really understand it is that when a guy is walking down the street at night, he's not afraid he's going to get dragged into an alley and get raped. That is the best example of male privilege that I can provide. Now, does this give you any money? No. Does this give you a particular advantage in the world. Some would argue no, it's not, because men take greater risk-taking behaviors, but the reality is that the barrier in a woman's mind of not wanting to walk to her car at night alone, not feeling safe, walking from her car outside to her apartment, things like this. These are social controls that we have to consider. It is a privilege to feel like you can have an interaction with the police, to show another type of privilege, and not get shot. And privilege is a very difficult concept because it's hard to measure tangibly, and it's a spectrum. Just because someone is a white male doesn't mean they're 100% privileged. A wealthy, able-bodied white male is exceptionally privileged. A rich, able-bodied male of any type is, much more privileged than a less wealthy person. Wealth is definitely an equalizer to an extent. It's a complicated system, and I caution people in applying it too rigidly or too reductively. It is a tool. It is not the last word on something. It's one of these things, like, if you imagine it's a costume skin, it's a skin on the game, or it's a heads-up display in a video game. You can swap that out, you can change it, but just be really careful that you're not making it more of your experience than it really has to be. It's an interesting way of examining issues. It is not something that should be used as a weapon. So, telling somebody to check their privilege while you're having a conversation on social media, probably not the best idea. In a liberal arts campus dorm room, knock yourself out. But so many of these calls to check privilege are actually indicators of intellectual privilege, or educational privilege more accurately. And this just shows how complicated this concept is. I have decided to step away from this word after my experiences with Gamer's Guide to Feminism. It is too charged. There are other ways of saying the same thing without it becoming this trigger word that upsets people. I think that while the concept is important to explore, the use of the word is decidedly unhelpful in my little corner of this discussion. So just so you know, that's my position on the word privilege. This brings us to the word misogyny. This is probably the easiest one. Misogyny is not an awkward phrase. It is not something coming out the wrong way, and it is not about being sexually attracted to a woman. It is an actual fear and hatred of women. It inhabits the realm of hostile sexism, and sexism is the last word I'm going to define, but it is a subset of sexism, yes, but it is virulent and inherently damaging immediately. It is, it is something that I think is an overused term sometimes, but that doesn't mean it isn't very real. The problem is that it is something of a subjective term. Misogyny is sort of... There are certain examples of misogynist behavior that are undeniable. For instance, serial rapists who violently rape women. They're misogynists. But in the real world, it is much harder to apply this label in practice than it is to examine the idea in theory. And I think it is much more productive to point out misogynist behaviors or misogynist images or, art, writing, than it is to label a person across the board a misogynist. Not that you can't do it, but it's much harder without, a lot of exposure to a person. A work of art is different. Some people will deliberately explore that space. And that's what a lot of hip-hop music is. And when people say, oh, how can you listen to this and still be a feminist? Well, because it's lyrical content, it's artistic expression. Just because people put voice to something doesn't mean they say it's right. They could actually be exploring a dark part of humanity, and that is a part of art. Someone creating a misogynist work of art does not necessarily mean the performer is misogynist, and this is an important distinction to make, especially when it comes to art. So hopefully that clears up my thought. The definition is simple on that one. The application is much more difficult. And the next, and the final term I'm going to define today is even dicier still. And like I said, that term is sexism. Sexism is basically a bias among the sexes. And there is some, like racism, there is some disagreement as to whether sexism and racism and all these things refer to the actions of an individual or systems. When you hear the idea that women can't be sexist or, non-white people can't be racist, it's because those people believe that racism and sexism is a system, not an action or a point of view. And the reason they say that non-whites and women can't engage in this is it doesn't benefit them. I don't agree with, I shouldn't say I don't agree. I think that there are instances where we do have to look at acts of sexism committed by women, because women are less likely to engage in the flat-out hostile sexism that holds women back. But women do participate in a lot of benevolently sexist attitudes. The idea that women should be cherished and protected to a larger degree than men, that women are automatically seen as caregivers as opposed to financial support for the family, being less important by default. These are all benevolently sexist attitudes. They're not necessarily so. And the problem with these attitudes is when people do defy them, they're seen as strange. And that means that they have to exert more energy, possibly be judged quite harshly for defying these gender roles that may make it seem beneficial or easier for women in the short term. But it actually leads to a very real marginalization long term. And we see this very much in the criminal justice system. The fact that women are still seen to this day as less culpable in crimes as men are. Men are seen as sort of predators who should be aware of what they're doing. Women are seen as somehow unable to help themselves in a lot of courts, and there is greater lenience on women because of these attitudes. Now, this may seem, hey, great, easy ride. The problem with this attitude of, oh, you can't really help yourself, you're not a fully autonomous, conscious person, is that attitude limits a woman's potential. It limits her agency in the world and her sense that she has an internal locus of control, that she can control her circumstances, that she can improve her circumstances, and that she can actually affect the world around her. The idea that she can't help it is very nearest neighbors to she can't help herself. And that's where it becomes a real issue. So while this idea of equality under the law is seen as a men's rights issue, it's actually in the Seneca Falls Convention, which is one of the first ever feminist documents ever, that those women wanted to be treated as equally culpable under the law and not seen as a less accountable person when a crime was committed in the presence of her husband. And these are the sorts of things that have been lost because the armchair pop culture activist wings of the feminist movement, who are sort of rewarded for being as noisy and as attention-getting as they can be with very simple messages. Historically, the propaganda wings, going back to the suffragettes, have relied very heavily on leveraging benevolent sexism for media attention. The way that the suffragettes sort of work the system and the prison system all leverage benevolent sexism in a very real way. And this is the challenge and the pitfall in just emulating what past waves of feminism and what past feminists have done. You can't just replicate what someone in the first wave or the second wave did, because they were digging out of such a deficit that a lot of their actions were tinged with an element of sexism in and of themselves. We have to develop and recognize that this sort of development is incremental. The suffragettes did undeniably move things forward. The second wave of feminism undeniably moved things forward. The third wave, or the fourth wave, as you may call it, the early third wave was fighting its own fight, getting the definition of rape broadened so it doesn't have to be just a penis entering a vagina without a consent. It broadened the rape laws so that men could under the law be sexually assaulted, among other things. But that wasn't why they did it. It was things like well, it's too graphic. I won't get into it here, but that's what early third wave stuff did. And it was the move from advancing women as a class through things like Title IX, which is flawed, and the failed Equal Rights Amendment, and the concept of equal pay for equal work and Roe versus Wade, things like that. The third wave was originally about the individualized female experience, and that's tricky because it's such a mosaic. And this fourth wave, this internet phenomenon that may or may not eventually be seen as its own thing, it's umbrellaed into third wave now, because anyone can call themselves a feminist. Just like, they're like any ideology, it's not present your papers, there's no certification process. People are all on their own journeys. And just because someone identifies as a feminist does not mean that they're not still working through their own sort of gendered soup within their head, and each individual person has to come to their own conclusions about what they think, perfect equality looks like, and that's tricky, right? Because it means stepping away from things like women and children first. Children, are given, but that that came from an era where it was a different time, um, and while it's quite tempting to lean back on the idea of women and children first and score those political points of, oh, how can you say that to a woman? It ends up hurting female leaders in the long run, because it does mean they're taken less seriously. It does send that message that there is a lowered expectation for women, that women can't take it the same way a man can. And that may have short-term benefits for a great many women, but when it comes to those upper echelons, those leadership roles, hyper-competitive spaces, there is no room for treat her like a lady. Now, that doesn't mean, that is separate. Actually, it's not. The idea, if you wouldn't do it to a guy, don't do it to a woman. And that leads into the discussion of, are there things we really shouldn't be doing to guys? And this whole idea of civility and appropriate conduct and boundaries and things like that. But we can't have that discussion as long as we adhere to a double standard. And that is the very tricky, unpacked exploration of the idea of sexism I wanted to present. Now, this is probably very different than what you've heard from other scholars. And here's why. Remember I said that we can't just replicate the actions of previous waves? Well, our regurgitative education system encourages that. The fact that academia is based on citations, and you can't use an idea unless it's a collection of other ideas that other people have had, leads to echo chambers that are controlled by the various institutions. So a good women's studies program or gender studies program will expose people to multiple types of feminist thought, including people like Camille Paglia, Christina Hoff Sommers, as well as the Dwork side and some of the second waivers, the Betty Friedan's and the Simone de Beauvoir's and, the fundamental reading. But a lot of places don't. A lot of places limit the course lists, because of this, whatever you want to call it. There is gatekeeping in academia. And so the quality of the programs, because there's no certification program at the end, it's an interdisciplinary liberal arts degree. There's no quality control. And most people, they go in, they get their degree by regurgitating, they get out and they continue to regurgitate. But that's not the realm of creatives. Creatives create. And so what I'm hoping to offer people is some new thinking here. Yes, based on an awareness of what's come before. But we need to continue to evolve and continue to challenge. Feminism is not a gospel. It shouldn't be treated like a religion. It's not. And when you start treating it like a religion, you're doing it wrong. It's always question, always. The entire thrust of feminism historically has been questioning what it means to be a woman. And sometimes the act of asking the question is more important, more profound than the whatever answer you come to. It's that whole imagination is more important than knowledge kind of idea. And I think we have to be what the third wave was defined as early is an idea of mosaic femininity, stepping away from this idea of women as a class and, you know, these tropes, these archetypes, defining the dialogue, broadening the idea of what individual women can be, making it less restrictive. You know, you don't have to wear high-heeled shoes because you're female. You don't have to wear dresses because you're female. You don't have to always do your hair or wear makeup because you're female. You know, these are... We are trying to get to a point where people, individuals, are more invested in who they are as individuals as opposed to, am I good at womaning? Am I womaning wrong? And obviously there are some regressives that are on a different path, but women as a class is the fight of the second wave. And women as individuals is the current horizon, or maybe even the next one. I'm not sure we're there yet. But that's what I'm trying to do. And if you're wondering why my approach to feminism is so different, is that I'm actually presenting an informed perspective of for today, an evolution, continuing this dialogue, instead of just replicating something from an era that has a nostalgic appeal, but is right now behind the times.